Welcome back, everybody. I'm Dr. Craig Malkin, clinical psychologist and lecturer for Harvard Medical School. I'm also the author of Rethinking Narcissism, which is devoted to helping you understand and cope with narcissism in all its forms, in all your relationships. What is the biggest barrier to leaving a difficult relationship? And this is across the board. It doesn't just apply to somebody who's got pathological narcissism that you might be in a relationship with. The biggest barrier to leaving an unhealthy or difficult relationship is actually something that I call defensive empathy. To give you an idea of what defensive empathy is, first let's just look at what it even means to think about something as positive as empathy, as defensive. I share with people over and over again in my practice and try to do it in my writings too, just a notion that anything in human experience can be used adaptively or defensively. It's on our behalf and adaptive, and if it opens us up to experience, helps us remain close in healthy ways in relationships, doesn't cut us off from important needs and feelings. It is defensive if it leads to us avoiding aspects of ourselves, parts of ourselves, means of self-expression, empties us out of some of those experiences that we might otherwise have. That is defensive. If you want to think about how this looks in a relationship and exactly what defensive empathy means, I often share as a metaphor a study that a developmental psychologist that you may have heard of named Piaget did on little children, where he set up this mountain. There's this large mountain scene, and around it were cows and chickens and barns and all kinds of things. And he would walk a child at a certain age, preschool, I'm really thinking, if I'm remembering correctly, but really young, walk them around, maybe even younger than that, and have them take in the scene that they were seeing and describe it. What do you see in front of you? Oh, I see a cow, I see horses, and do it a few times to the point where they got the hang of it, that they're to describe what they see in front of them. And then he would stand on the opposite side, and they'd now pretty much been able to describe everything all around that mountain scene, those little kids. And if he asked them what they see, they would describe what they see. But if he asked them what he sees, they would still describe what they see. It's a phenomenon called normal egocentricity that we grow out of as we start to understand other people have perspectives too, and their view might be different than ours, metaphorically and literally. In the case of defensive empathy, what happens is we are in relationships with somebody who always insists, if we want to be close to them, if we want to share in an experience with them, if we want to meet with their approval, we have to describe and keep in mind what is on their side of the mountain. So imagine this, that essentially this is a situation where it's the opposite. You are defensive empathy as you are standing in front of the mountain and you've got that scene in front of you. And if this is resonating with you at all, I will speak to you directly. You cannot see your side of the mountain. And I understand why you can't see your side of the mountain, because you weren't allowed to, that you had to kind of sacrifice that perspective and always keep in mind the other view. So you might even, in a sense, when you're in front of that scene, especially if you struggle with egoism, you might say, even though you've got little cows and a sheep and all of that, and on the other side, there's a fire engine and blazing fire and emergency vehicles and all kinds of mayhem and chaos. What do you see in front of you? And you might then say, I see a blazing fire engine and all kinds of mayhem and chaos. That is the predictable outcome of having to adapt to and be close emotionally and psychologically in a relationship with somebody who's extremely narcissistic, because they insist on you always keeping in mind what their experience is if you want to be close to them. How do you break out of this? How do you recognize defensive empathy? Well, I've given you one metaphor to kind of think about it, but one of the hallmarks of defensive empathy is that as soon as you start to get in touch with your own disappointment, that is, what's missing, and not take into account from your perspective what your side of the mountain is, as soon as you start to get in touch with that, this is where defensive empathy kicks in. The way this looks in my conversations with people that I help in my practice is something like I'm trying to help them get in touch with their disappointment and anger. And if you've listened to anything that I've shared, that you know anger and adaptive anger is so important in connecting to our own sense of what's important, our core sense of self, our deeper needs, so that we can stand up and say no and set boundaries. So inevitably in my work, when I'm trying to help somebody leave a difficult relationship, I try to help them get in touch with that healthy anger. And what happens, they start to do that, and they're saying, he shouldn't treat me this way, she shouldn't have called me those names, whatever form it takes. They suddenly shift, and I hear and see the shift in their tone of words. I see it on their face, and it's something like, I can't talk to him that way. I could never talk to him this way, even though we're not talking about practicing that this is what you would say. It's just a feeling. They will report feeling like they have somehow forgotten about all the horrible things that happened to their partner or their friend. I mean, they went through so much. How could I possibly feel this way towards them? Well, the answer is it's just a feeling. What I want you to notice in the shift in defensive empathy is that it's a change in the conversation. It's as if another friend were to come along to you and say, well, what about her? Well, what about him? As you're trying to talk about, what you see in front of you and your perspective and how it affects you. You wouldn't like it if they changed the conversation. This is like that internal mechanism that you had to develop where you always have to change the conversation to the other person in order to have a connection to them. In other words, you can think about it as the what about me transit, the what about you transition, or what about them, right? In the case of somebody who's extremely narcissistic, it always somehow comes back to, what it is they're struggling with or what's important in their life or experience. What about me? To stay connected to someone like that, you need the what about you or what about them transition, the change in the conversation. And that's what defensive empathy is. So if you want to keep an eye on it, ask yourself, what would I be feeling towards this person if I wasn't thinking, oh my gosh, look what they went through, look what their childhood is. All of that might even be true. But the point is, what is your feeling? What is that perspective in front of you in response to what they might have done or said when the relationship is difficult or challenging or even unhealthy? That is defensive empathy, and that is the way to move it to the side. So I hope that's been helpful. If you like the video, please give it a big thumbs up. Don't forget to ring the bell so you can get notifications when I do new videos, because I'm going to have plenty coming. Thanks, and I hope to share with you some more.